welcome to episode 8 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including top products, the latest trends, news, expert tips, and interviews with top security industry company representatives. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello there.
Hey, Andrew. As we dive into a different featured topic each episode, new episodes of the podcast come out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest one. And feel free to leave a comment or email us at podcast@firewalls.com with feedback or questions. Now on to our featured topic and guest for this episode.
Anyone who follows cybersecurity news, or the news in general, is probably familiar with the term ransomware. It's a cyber attack type that is on the rise around the globe. And we know that victims have included businesses, local governments, and hospitals, just to name a few. But other than hearing the name of a ransomware strain or connecting the originator to a country or region, we often don't hear much in the news about who is behind the ransomware attacks.
Our guest for this episode not only knows ransomware inside and out, he's referred to in SonicWall circles as their ransomware czar. But he's also had the unique opportunity to connect with and interview a Russian ransomware cell, a cell he still remains in contact with. He recently hosted a webinar titled Mindhunter, explaining how this all came to be and some of what he's learned, and we'll be picking his brain more here today. We welcome Brook, Chelmo, Senior Product Marketing Manager for SonicWall.
Hi.
Hey, Brook, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And so the first thing we like to do with our guests is to get to know a little bit more about what they do. So how would you describe a typical day in your position with SonicWall?
Well, in my self-centered view, I'm the center of the product lifecycle, kind of the crux of that figure eight or that infinity circle of getting feedback from customers and bringing this to product management where they're building and then I communicate out what has been built. Of course, they have their own feedback loops as well, but we're part of that. So I'm connected to the product team at the hip and through them engineering. I also work with sales and our channel partners a lot too. So I funnel that feedback from the field to them and convey changes back to the field. I do a lot of different creative things as well along the way to prepare for the various numerous product launches that we have. And ultimately, our goal is to make sure that you're knowledgeable about what's new and you're excited about it as well.
So we hear that you're sort of SonicWall's ransomware czar. So for those who may not fully understand the concept, what exactly is ransomware and what makes it so dangerous?
So the interesting thing about ransomware is that it's the only form of malware that wants to be discovered. This is why you're seeing a lot of very interesting and strange, kooky, creepy, weird ransomware notes that go on devices that actually, kind of tries to trick you or inspire you to pay just to get rid of it. Pictures of the devil, pictures of just weird things. I've yet to see any sexual ones, thankfully. But anyways, the attacker wants to encrypt your files on your system. And sometimes they actually try to encrypt the files for the operating system itself to really lock you out of that computer. They want to try to mitigate the ability to roll things back or change things, say the VSS image within Microsoft Windows. They're going to hold a key to unlock that file. Sometimes it's the same key that's used everywhere. Sometimes it's an individual key for an individual system. But nonetheless, they're going to set a price based on what they've experienced in terms of getting a good payout. They all want to be about paid out in the middle, if not, high 70% if they could be. So they're going to try to get that threshold of payment. And they're also going to determine their price based on the size or the style of the system that they have. If it's a server, it's going to be more than an endpoint.
And so the Mindhunter webinar you recently hosted not only discusses ransomware, but also provides a peek behind the curtain of an actual ransomware cell known as Hildacrypt and what you learned from your interactions with them. So first of all, how did you initially get in touch with them and what gave you the idea to pursue a more in-depth look at the people behind the ransomware?
Almost about 2 months ago, SonicWall discovered Hildacrypt in the wild, and they wrote an article on this. And because it was a little funky, involved the cartoon and, kind of interesting, they pushed this out there. We like these kind of things. So I pushed that article out on Twitter, and Hildacrypt actually retweeted me. And since I had their attention, I thought, what would I say to them? Would you say, like, game on, or, you'd go take a long walk off a short pier? But since they know me and I don't know them, I thought I would change that. We say friends come and go, but enemies accumulate. So I want to play nice. So I kindly asked if we could talk, and they agreed. We laid down some ground rules. We set up a secure channel to communicate through, and we were talking within, an hour or two of making contact on Twitter.
So this subject also seems to dovetail well with your background as a great hacker and your personal interest in things like sociology, European politics, theology. How did that unique background inform your interactions with Hildacrypt and your perspective on their behavior?
Well, I would like to say a former gray hat hacker, just to make sure, in case the editor is listening to this.
So when I first started to speak with them, I thought I was dealing with the stereotypical ruthless cyber criminal gang of young to middle-aged engineers who are really out there to, get paid hard, like the Grand Crab crew, which recently retired after making almost $1 billion. My first questions to them were more about the motivators, about supporting their families or, sports cars, trying to get the human side of it, understand the people. Because when you see people popping their head up like I saw Hildacrypt doing, usually it's flashy. They love cars, they love the money and the phones and the jewelry. But after a while, I realized it was clear I was talking with someone with a very different mind and a very different set of motives. What became evident was that I was dealing with people who are kind of harboring a lot of pain. And I've always said that hurting people want to hurt people, and this is what they were doing. In terms of, you can hear the echoes of the Russian education system, the propaganda, and the kind of the years of hardship at play. The Arab Spring was inspired by people going onto YouTube and Facebook and seeing what the lives outside of the Arabic Peninsula and the area was actually like, and they wanted something better. And in the case of Russians, they can see that better lifestyle, or what they think is a better lifestyle. But they've seen that the people who are living that lifestyle are living under governments who've put hardships on the Russian way of life, and their life would be better had they not been through that. So that being said, we're seeing a lot of that. The blog that I wrote on LinkedIn goes into about a 1,000-year cycle of history, which explains why the East and West kind of hate each other, and we live under a lot of presuppositions that lead to a lot of prejudice. I think my end game with the blog that I wrote on LinkedIn is to help people better understand that side of the world so that they may be more inclined to help them participate in the developing economy, or otherwise, the former Soviet Union will just be a haven for hackers for generations to come.
You mentioned the demographic challenges there in terms of, maybe a lack of options for people to find a way to make money. And so do you think that the world as it stands today is moving in a direction that may provide maybe more wholesome alternatives to these groups of people?
Yes and no. There are opportunities outside of Russia, but they would require an opportunity to leave it, which is far more difficult than it sounds. I myself, having lived in 3 different countries, know the challenge there, especially when you have a family. But secondly, those of us who are hiring will be hesitant to hire contractors from that region. My LinkedIn post covers some of the strategies to help with that trust angle. Now, Kaspersky remains one of the large employers in Moscow and one of the last cybersecurity firms to actually work out of there. But the prejudice in a relationship that they have with the nation state, of the Russian Federation is making it hard for people to trust them. That's harder for them to kind of expand operation, hire more people in their region. And even people like Twig want to work there, but it may be very limiting, and they're going to need to level up their skills, which is kind of part of what Twig is doing with Hildacrypt.
Getting a tad political here, but this situation seems to be like some issues facing modern law enforcement agencies in what we tend to think of as the more poverty-stricken or crime-ridden neighborhoods. Some police departments turn to things like outreach programs or community policing, similar strategies that seek to address the causes of crime rather than treating them as a symptom. So hypothetically, what would this kind of community policing strategy look like for the network security world? Do you think this is something that we should be pursuing?
I honestly don't think that law enforcement can really help per se in terms of the community policing, because a lot of these things are done very privately. And I would be a little surprised if all the different members of Hildacrypt knew each other. But ultimately, law enforcement in this equation can provide us a little bit of the stick and the carrot and stick analogy. But ultimately, if companies are willing to hire people with clean records and give them opportunity, people will have the motivation to do the right thing. If you go down to Latin America, where there isn't a lot of opportunity, but just a high quantity of high-grade people who just have great personality, who have great character, who want to do the right thing, but who don't have opportunities to do things, it's ultimately the opportunities that really enable people to do sometimes the right thing. Of course, there should also be an allowance for those who don't have not so clean records here, but the number of people with clean records that are out there far outweigh that number because it's hard to catch some of these people. But ultimately, giving people that opportunity to work and apply their skills to protect people should be motivation enough for them to play it straight.
So we talk about the main motivation behind ransomware being usually money. We've also mentioned the sort of flash. What other motivations did you uncover when you talked to Hildacrypt? Were there specific members like Twig, for instance, that had different kinds of motivation?
In the case of what Twig was doing, it kind of reminded me of going back to the 90s when people were doing different forms of hacking more for the attention before it became a way to get paid. Obviously, cryptocurrency has been a big motivator and a big enabler of people to hack for profit. Before, it was a very difficult way of exfiltrating data and trying to sell that data in the black market without getting caught. In this case, Twig wants to be seen. He wants to show off to his peers and, to say, hey, look at me, I'm being covered by these publications. There's a webcast where they covered me, so I'm kind of falling into that. And I'm aware of that, but that's fine. My message to him is to, be careful. You're a young person and you will eventually could get caught if you stick your head up too much. And, and also my motivator to him and others like him is saying, there are ways to work ethically and there's ways of using your skills for good, because ultimately you probably could get paid more than you would from doing this without having any of the risk. But again, when you're young, you may do some things that, are kind of a little foolish to get that attention. Just like you see people, driving down the interstate at 120 miles an hour and getting pulled over. It feels good. It's exciting. It's through it. And people can see you. It's fun, but it really doesn't benefit you. So with that being said, Twig has other motivators as well. He wants to keep building and keep testing himself. The ransomware that he's building now is going to be nasty. Absolutely nasty. He's following some of the business models for SamSam ransomware. Again, those creators also have been caught and arrested. So with that being said, he's just like any other young person out there who wants to, improve themselves. They want some attention. And he also has the interesting goal of trying to own source code to many ransomware families, much like one would collect Mickey Mantle baseball cards.
You mentioned at one point in the webinar that even though, infecting networks with ransomware is quite harmful, groups like Hildacrypt, for instance, have an actual code of ethics. So what's Hildacrypt's code as you understand it, and how do you reconcile this sort of ethical, unethical behavior?
People are often confused on the webcast when I talked about their ethics, and people can only really see black and white in many cases when it comes to dealing with this type of stuff. And the comments that I got back were sometimes a little bit on the edge racist and really steeped in their understanding of history and how people should be treated. And so with that being said, I do mention ethics, and some people think it's one or the other, it's virtuous or villainous. And in this case, there are some ethics. They won't attack children's laptops, for example, within a school district. They also won't go after hospitals. They also will not go after any Russian assets. They said that, one brother shouldn't attack another. And since they see us as, evil and having benefited from evils in the past in their perspective, they have, again, no qualms going after us, but they won't go after someone like a hospital, or they won't go after, medical records or patient records because, depriving someone of life is just so wrong for them, and a few other things that kind of fall into the realm of, maybe we shouldn't be doing this.
Both the name of the ransomware cell is named after a Netflix show, Hilda, and the name of your webinar is named after a Netflix show, Mindhunter. Just a coincidence?
In that case, I think it is. The team here thought, let's go after this because, Brook likes to go after these interesting stories. So that is a coincidence. But again, it's probably from a mind that's smarter than mine.
You address a few misconceptions relating to hackers that seem pretty prevalent over the course of the webinar, and you've already touched on a couple here. So you're saying, first of all, that ransomware cells aren't necessarily made up of dozens of hooded Guy Fawkes masks wearing men pecking away at their keyboards 24/7?
Yes. So what is interesting about the kind of the hacking ecosystem is that we'd like to think that it's, the guy in the basement, like in any Hollywood movie, who's, yelling at his mother for Hot Pockets. There are those, obviously people that are out there, but they're not very successful. And I think in today's modern ecosystem, you have to team up to succeed. In many cases, sometimes attacks are a mixture of things created with different exploit kits or different script kind of kits. So it's very rare that someone would just from the ground up make this wonderful form of code or this ransomware strain that does everything by itself. And then when they update it, they're going to start over again. Now, a lot of things are recycled. There's widgets and there's different things that are out there. And in fact, Twig told me about one organization he's connected with. They only do one thing. They rent out emotet infections for Latin American banks. They just focus on that one thing, and they're able to make money doing it. Just because IT systems are a little bit more backwards there, and they don't have the budgets and the ability to update those systems. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities for them to exploit. So again, there are crews out there who just focus on doing one thing and one thing only. Or if they want to do something bigger, but they'll go and rent out something, use it within their code, and then see if they get results.
So that brings us a bit to another misconception for hackers is people think that they're creating sort of specialized custom code for every attack, whereas you talk to Twig and he says they're kind of relying on tried and true methods. What are some of the low-hanging fruit tactics that hackers like this employ?
Well, part of it is just going after common vulnerabilities. Every single year we issue thousands of CVEs for all these different vulnerabilities and this and vulnerabilities and that. But in reality, it's, the Microsoft ones. It's, things that with, say, remote desktop usage. It's the ones related to the different file types that you can use within an attack like Adobe. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. The other thing, too, is going after, IP addresses and email addresses and just trying to ping these things frequently. And we see this a lot. And we just worked with someone recently who had been breached. What ended up happening is that they just guessed the password to someone within the organization. And what they were doing, when we looked at the logs, they would guess the password 3 times for one email address. Then the script would rotate to the next email address. It would guess 3 times, rotate to the next one, guess, back and forth. And this is what happens all the time. And if you own a web domain, you're going to see in your logs all the time people trying to guess the password to the domain. People trying to do things all the time. They rotate the IP address. It's nonstop, 24 hours a day. This is why every year, I think SonicWall blocks, almost 4 trillion IPS attacks every single year just like this. So we see that kind of low kind of fruit, easy attack style. And then it's once they actually guess the password or get that infection to operate to give them remote access, then they will then try to go in and then put some more effort and work into what they've already found.
So you touched on quite a bit in the webinar, but I'm sure probably had a lot that you couldn't get to within the hour format. So was there anything that you didn't get to in that webinar that you wished you could include?
Well, I think a lot of it would be doing more deep dives into firewall misconfiguration because obviously I work for a firewall company and we sell firewalls, lots and lots of firewalls every single year. I think we have over 3 million that are actively out there pinging home today. So a lot of firewalls, but again, there's easy to misconfigure because these are highly detailed devices. They're wonderful devices. And we want to make sure that people have them configured correctly. So that's one thing that eventually we need to go into and people have a lot of questions about. There's a lot of people with questions about decrypting encrypted traffic with DPI SSL. We get a lot of that too. And then also, of course, when it comes to port security and port management, I probably want to do a deep dive on that. But again, that would take another hour for each of those topics.
So now that we've had time to reflect on this webinar adventure and see feedback from viewers and commenters, is there any misconceptions that you'd like to clear up?
Well, I think part of it is that people took my respect for the attackers or the hackers as respect for what they're doing. I was called, look at this libtard or this progressive. Yeah, maybe it is a little progressive, and my goal is to eventually see in 3 generations from now, Russians working side by side, Germans and Americans and Canadians and Japanese together working to protect our organizations. But I think that's part of it too, is that one is its goal of trying to convert people like Twig and the Hildacrypt crew into being white hat hackers, the people who ultimately protect the world's information. And the other part of it too is that people have a hard time seeing, or we're having a hard time seeing, the difference between Russia and Russians. Yes, there's been a lot of catastrophes, a lot of evils that have been perpetuated by people within the government, all the way going from, say, Tsar Nicholas I all the way down to, the modern days with Vladimir Putin. But we want to, say that, there's good people and there's Russians in this company. They're great people. And they're very different from the people that you would expect. So I think part of it is understand that there's people are different. Go meet a Russian if you've never met one before, make a friend. And then ultimately, ask yourself, what's this guy trying to say? And I guess that's where I'd leave it at that.
And so you mentioned a goal then of maybe making folks into more of the white hat hacker side of things. I think the one thing did strike me in the webinar was Twig did provide some tips really to keep people from being a victim of a ransomware attack. So what do you think, first of all, motivated that? And then secondly, what were some of those tips?
Well, obviously, I had to scrub out a lot of the bad language that he was using to make it readable for the user. But it was, use real passwords. His favorite story was when he found that, I think it was a web admin, had used 2 quotation marks as his password. If you want your end users to follow best practices, you have to follow them yourself. So one, you start using passphrases. Stop using passwords on the same site everywhere. If your password's been compromised on one site, you got to change it on all of them if it's the same password, and never use it again. There's that one. The other one is using real people. He's young. He's part of the forefront of people that, are using the OK Boomer hashtag. So, he's like, he told me right off the bat, don't hire boomers, and boomers are terrible. And, in reality, people are people. And, yes, maybe some of us who are aging are kind of resting on our laurels and relaxing a bit. But in reality, hire good, qualified people. He's also recommending using a good programming language. He mentioned using C, but nothing written in C has ever been secure ever, is kind of the joke within cybersecurity. But C++, Ruby on Rails, Ruby, these things are all much more secure and have less commonly known vulnerabilities than, say, Java, PHP, and C.
I guess one final question I would have then also is, you mentioned that you're continuing contact and you touched on a long-term goal, but what do you think you gain and they may gain from just having an ongoing dialogue?
Well, part of it for me is trying to understand the real side of things. And, I understand hackers in more of an academic sense of the word because, I deal with general threat vectors and general problems, but to actually get down and see how it's really being used. What was more of a learning curve for me was, how he's attacking specific ports, but more or less how he's using Discord, which is becoming this really good platform for hackers. If you're not familiar with what Discord is actually a game chat channel. And within Discord, you can develop scripts and do different things to make Discord do things for you. For example, if a rare Pokemon pops up in your neighborhood, you could get a ping from the service that could tell you that it's down the street. So instead of finding these things accidentally, you can be more targeted and find these things. People can do a lot of different scripts within Discord, and hackers are actually using it because Discord really isn't doing any monitoring of what's happening on these servers. And they can spin them up very easily. When they try to ping or probe from their location, it's actually pinging from a point of presence in a country that's not normally blocked by some web admins and other administrators, such as Turkey, Russia, China. So that's what I gained from it. But what they gained from it, I think, more or less is, to use us to give some attention to them. But like I mentioned to you before, that attention really doesn't have any value. And it doesn't matter if the whole world has your crew's name tattooed on their arm and everyone loves you. Unless you can benefit from it, it doesn't really help you at all. If anything, it's going to hurt you because you will eventually become a target to the police, who will now start taking bribes, and to law enforcement, will try to eventually trick you into going on a vacation in a country where they can extradite you to their country and prosecute you.
Unless they're getting royalties from every viewing of Hilda on Netflix, maybe.
That could eventually be, but yeah, he feels confident that if the police did come knocking around, it would take no less than $10, $20 to get them to walk away.
So was there anything else you wanted to add?
ultimately, it's follow best practices and stay secure and keep things patched. That's generally a big part of the story. And it's using, effective security products that are up to date. And, there are a lot of people out there that I've met who will run a firewall, but they won't turn on any services. And it's kind of like trying to go and enjoy an ice cream cone without any ice cream in the cone. The firewall today, without these services turned on, is kind of worthless. They go and they turn on GeoIP filtering to block countries, but in reality, we can see here that it doesn't really work at all. In fact, if you go to the Capture Security Center on SonicWall's website, you'll see very little to no activity coming out of Russia because they all use VPNs and bulletproof servers in countries like, say, Sweden or in Switzerland to launch their attacks.
Where can people learn more about what you've learned? We have the webinar and the blog post. Where can people find that stuff?
Well, of course, you can go to, you can just Google my name and, type in maybe Hilda, and you'll find that on LinkedIn. But if you want the SonicWall blog, go to blog.sonicwall.com, and the webcast will be on Bright Talk. And just type in my name on Bright Talk, and you'll find that one as well. But just stay tuned on the blog from SonicWall. There's a lot of new updated information all the time. And if there's any updates to any new stories or any new crews that I, have contact with, you'll eventually find those there.
We will keep an eye out.
All right, thank you very much.
And now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we discuss a few top news stories in the network security world and what they may mean to you. On to headline number 1. The hospitals hit by ransomware attacks are seeing an increase in heart patients' death rates. This stays on our ransomware theme, and it's also sort of a follow-up on a story we did a couple episodes back about some hospitals being hit with ransomware attacks. This story lays out some potential life and death implications of how medical facilities respond to being victimized.
Right, and this could have made a good headline for our Halloween spooky threats. Ransomware does tend to target hospitals a lot, mostly because it's a lot of easy ways for the hackers to win, so to speak. Not just the obvious ransom aspect, but when you can exfiltrate patient data and medical records, that tends to go for a good amount of money on the dark web.
There is a lot of data stored in hospital databases, that's for sure. And as we talked about before, a lot of potential ways in to get into a hospital network. But this story, a study by Vanderbilt University and University of Central Florida researchers, has found that corrective actions taken by hospitals to improve their IT security can actually worsen the quality of care and disrupt care processes when handled incorrectly. So this study is actually looking into hospitals that have already had some kind of a breach occur, and then finding that in response to the breach, maybe they forgot that they still need to keep patient care at the forefront.
Right. And this is what we talk about when we speak about the sort of trade-off with cybersecurity. Is there are going to be some slowdowns in processes. For example, if every time you need to access some data, you need to sign in with multi-factor authentication, that does add some time elapsed, before you get to your actual resources.
Yeah, so really the key takeaway of this story is you have to balance that need for cybersecurity with the need to do what you're supposed to do as a hospital, and which is save people's lives. So this study used Medicare Compare data from 2012 to 2016 and merged it with data breach data. I've said data and data during this, so forgive
both
me.
Acceptable.
Yeah. Covering about 3,000 hospitals, and found hospital time to electrocardiogram for heart patients increased as much as 2.7 minutes. This is a type of situation with heart patients where every second really counts. And 30-day acute myocardial infarction mortality, that's a mouthful, increased as much as 0.36 percentage points in the 3 years following a breach. So what does that actually mean in terms of the implications there.
And what really stuck out to me here was that this is not just the media aftermath of a breach, but like you said, this is several years down the road, and they were still measuring delays in response times of 2 minutes sometimes. So this really goes to show you how even just a single breach has an impact that reaches quite further than the obvious service level remediation and cleanup.
Yeah, and so when we talk about it being a life or death issue, 0.36% sounds like a pretty small number, but if you put that up to 1,000 patients, for instance, that's 0.36% of 1,000 is 3.6 additional deaths per 1,000 heart attacks at these hospitals. So, they probably deal with numbers like that in some cases, and those are 3 people or 4 people over the course of time that may have actually died because of this change in reaction to a data breach.
Right. And in some cases, patients are being cut off from critical services for days or weeks because of this. And, this problem gets even worse when you're in a rural area or any other underserved regions where, that access is kind of counted on, and any small amount of delay can have some major impact.
Well, and that's the other key point here, because it is good that these hospitals are reacting to data breaches by trying to improve their processes and improving security, because the story that we're kind of using as the follow-up, which we talked about a couple of episodes back, there were data breaches, ransomware attacks in Alabama and Australia that actually were affecting patients on a day-to-day basis, appointments being canceled. Some of the hospitals were actually not taking emergency patients via ambulance because they didn't have their records in order. So even though we're talking about some difficulties having occurred after a breach, you do need to get your security in order.
Right. This is definitely not us trying to tell people to secure less or to try to minimize their cybersecurity impact, but you have to understand that does come with some trade-offs. So Adam Kujawa, the director of Malwarebytes Lab, recommends that you should always identify the juiciest data on your network and put additional security around that. And I think that would certainly help these delays, is knowing what your most important objectives are and hitting those before anything else.
And speaking of those most important objectives, as a hospital, you have to remember whatever processes you put into place, that you need to find ways to keep that patient care level as high up as possible. But really, the moral of the story overall is get your security processes and medical processes in order so that you don't ever have a ransomware attack occur at your hospital in the first place, and you won't have to deal with the aftermath. And now headline number 2. Cybersecurity for giving season. So many people mark the holidays by donating to a preferred cause. Charitable organizations consider this a stretch drive of sorts, with people especially thinking about others' welfare during the holiday season. So this piece points out that about half of all donations to churches in particular are made with a credit card online, which means credit card information is in danger of exposure even here when cybersecurity is not prioritized.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sad state of affairs to realize that you have to, think about the security of donation transaction even these days. I guess it goes to show wherever there is money, the hackers will come, even if it's, for charitable giving.
And these may be riper targets in a way. According to the insurer Church Mutual, only 11% of worshipers say they fear a cybersecurity breach at their place of worship. So if only 11% of the attendees and members of these churches and other religious institutions are even thinking about cybersecurity, then that probably means they're being a little more lax than they should when putting out their credit card information or other personal information.
Yeah, and the internet is everywhere these days, and it's getting to the point where we're going to have to start considering these cybersecurity measures in just about every aspect of our life, from going to church, going to work, going to the grocery store. It's getting to the point where you kind of have to look over your shoulder at every second.
Which I do. Sometimes my neck gets a little sore. But yeah, it is basically, it's just another place you need to worry about that it's not necessarily the first place you think about connecting cybersecurity concerns to, but it really should be a 24/7 part of your thought process. So this article encourages religious organizations to make cybersecurity a priority. That education aspect, not only with the membership, which obviously seems to be a little lacking in their cybersecurity awareness, but also, of course, employees, the donors that we're talking about here, and volunteers, because a lot of churches and other, charitable organizations have a lot of volunteers.
Right, and churches have those specific types of concerns that make them a bit unique when it comes to security. I think one of the most important things here is, like you said, there are different levels of users on a church network. You got staffers, volunteers, guests. I think it's important to consider the types of access levels that people are granted. That'd be a big help here, is letting users only access resources and applications that they need and locking them out of everything else that minimizes your exposure.
And you've got to figure people tithe or regularly give offerings to their churches. So you got to assume that church network may have, with the ability to do sort of online gift giving, a lot of personal information from their membership. So yeah, you really want to limit that access and segment your networks as much as possible so that it's not easy for somebody who shouldn't be able to see personal information to get to it.
In the insurance that wrote this article, Church Mutual, they've got a self-assessment tool on their webpage for churches to sort of see where they stand cybersecurity wise. So I would definitely recommend checking that out, or really any other tool to help you assess where you stand in cybersecurity is a great asset to have.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive one, and it's something that really applies even outside of the church space. They also included some tips in this article relating to Wi-Fi, which, of course, any of these public spaces, people use Wi-Fi. And so wanted to share a couple of those as well. One of the tips: avoid broadcasting the name of any protected networks publicly to minimize the number of external attempts to access them. It's a good tip that I don't know if everyone really thinks about, because default, if you have a bunch of Wi-Fi networks, then they're probably going to show up. So if people don't know that they're out there as obviously, then that's a good thing. Segment your networks to have a protected segment known only to internal staff and a guest segment for public use. Require permission to access the protected network. Ensure that any accounts making multiple unsuccessful attempts to log in are locked out. And of course, use firewalls and encryption to further restrict access to the network and the data on it. So those are good tips for any organization to think about.
Right. Church or no church, those are always good reasons to follow, especially as we move into the holiday season. Phishing scams are always out there, but social engineering attempts always need to sort of hinge on some inciting incident or hook. And with the holiday season, lots of transaction, higher amounts of giving and donations, just provides a lot of events around which phishing can be built.
Right. There are a lot of worthy causes out there, and certainly wouldn't want to scare anyone away from giving to those causes. But again, as with anything else, think about security and make sure everything is on the up and up when you're doing the giving. On to headline number 3. Over 480 million mobile VPN apps have been downloaded in the past year. So we mentioned VPN from time to time, largely in a work setting where an employer should have a virtual private network set up to securely support its remote workforce. But VPNs are getting more and more popular among home users as well, for added security when using others' Wi-Fi networks, general anonymity, and even access to geo-blocked content. Shout out to MLB.TV users. I'm a annual subscriber to that for watching baseball. And baseball, unfortunately, has a lot of blackout rules.
So do you use a VPN app?
I actually don't have a VPN app on my phone personally right now, but maybe I should join the crowd.
Yeah, it could be. It seems to be the popular new thing.
In fact, very popular. As we said, more than 480 million mobile VPN apps were downloaded from Android and iOS stores over the past year, which is up 54% from the year prior. 75% of those were Android apps, just because Android's a bit more ubiquitous around the globe. Mm-hmm. And that 54% increase, when you add up the last 3 years worth of downloads, pretty crazy. So 198 million in 2016 to 17, 311 million in 17 to 18, and that 480 million number from 18 to 19. So we're right around that billion range just in the last 3 years.
Yeah, and clearly every year over year, this is getting more and more popular. So what do you think's driving this surge? Is cybersecurity concepts just becoming more mainstream and top of mind for home users? Or, what else did this article point out as far as the reason behind this?
Personally, I do think that there are reasons that are just about practicality. There are streaming services and other things that have blocks on them for locations. As I was mentioning with Major League Baseball, you have blackout restrictions where maybe you can't watch certain teams' games in your local market, but you can get around that with VPN. Hopefully no one's listening to this. I don't think it's illegal, but either way. But there are different regional blocks and worldwide types of blocks on streamers. Going back to sports as well, I know people stream NFL games, and that's usually another use for VPN. But in the article, more specifically, they noticed that the most pronounced surge in VPN app downloads was in the Asia Pacific region, with about 190 million out of that 480 million. And many of the countries with the biggest spike are dealing with some kind of political unrest, with the government known for potentially monitoring internet usage and also blocking access to certain websites.
Yeah, and any place with stringent censorship or laws restricting freedom of expression, people are turning to VPNs to sort of get into the wider internet that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to have access to. So one thing I noted was that the United States was second on the list in the sheer volume of downloads, whereas they really only accounted for a 17% growth overall, whereas a country like India, they've got a 400% year-over-year growth with these VPN downloads. So clearly the rest of the world is sort of catching up, becoming more connected and tech-savvy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the article noted that the U.S. and India in particular having those big numbers is largely connected to just the fact that there are a lot of internet users in those countries compared to some others. But we talked about political unrest and websites being blocked, internet being monitored. And yet this 480 million number, all the numbers actually that we're talking about, does not include maybe the country that people perhaps think about the most when they think about privacy concerns and blocked websites and things online. China is not included in these numbers at all. So not only a very populous country, but probably a country in which a few of the citizens may look to explore.
Right, a place where VPNs are potentially very much needed. So one quote I pulled out here from the author is that it's clear that internet users around the world are taking action into their own hands to claw back internet freedoms that are being continually eroded by vested interests. So like we said, government censorship, even corporate interest where maybe you're not able to access the kinds of information you're looking for. And so you turn into a VPN, maybe hop to a different country and get a different perspective.
And as we mentioned, another reason for having a VPN connection is the encryption. So, if you're out using public Wi-Fi or things of that nature, it's an added layer of security for yourself wherever you are. And so hopefully there's a chunk of people out there that are thinking about that. But I'm sure in the US you do have the people who are looking for access to different services that they may not be able to access as well. One other note in this article, 85% of the downloads were free mobile VPN apps. And what I wanted to ping last on there was that you definitely want to make sure that you're downloading a legitimate one and not.
Yeah, always be safe with your downloads. The Apple Play Store or the Google Play Store and the Apple Store, they're pretty well vetted, but not 100% perfect.
Yeah, and especially I know the Apple Store is a little bit better and more stringent in terms of vetting of their apps. Sometimes some shadier ones can slip onto Android, and since that's where most of these people are downloading VPN apps from, definitely do your detective work before you just download the first VPN app that comes up in your search results.
And talking about popular VPNs, the top 3 VPN clients that were downloaded last year, Turbo VPN had 51.3 million downloads. Hotspot Shield had 42.8 million, and BetterNet was number 3 with 29.9 million.
So there's plenty of options out there and really no reason not to pursue them. Just be careful, as with anything. At Firewalls.com, we're fortunate to have a team of certified network engineers who offers a variety of services for top security brands like firewall configurations, endpoint deployment, and expert support, to name a few.
In our Engineers Minute, one of our experts takes a moment each episode to provide a tip or answer a question for you. And that's where you come in. Leave us a question in the comments or email us at podcast@firewalls.com, and you may get your question answered in a future episode.
On this edition, we welcome in another Kevin, our network engineer, to talk about playing in the sandbox.
Thanks, guys. So as a kid, I played in the sandbox, which, allowed an environment with a barrier to play in sand without contaminating the rest of the yard. So imagine this concept in a technical view. For years, we've had several on-the-box software in which we could play around with code and test downloaded applications in isolation. We could review what system resources would be affected if we were to install directly to our systems. Amazing, right? And you guessed it, they termed this sandboxing. What's even more amazing is that many of today's newest generation firewall appliances have become so robust with features, they even include a cloud version of this sandboxing. And each firewall appliance vendor has its own name for this elevated approach to network security. Sophos has Sandstorm, SonicWall has Capture ATP, Fortinet with its Forti Sandbox, and WatchGuard has APT Blocker. Many of these can also integrate with their vendor-specific endpoint clients for a highly customizable approach to network and system security. This is great in combating on-the-fly, ever-increasing amounts of highly sophisticated malware and virus attacks. In my experience, the only complaints I have received with these seem to be that the end user must wait a few seconds to get the download or email attachment. A few seconds to allow an automated cloud-based sandboxing service the time to review a download and determine if it's safe is well worth the added security measure. Cloud-based sandboxing is relatively quick and efficient. Most users wouldn't even notice. The security service is well worth the cost of licensing. Not to mention, there is no additional cost for hardware or software as this is all cloud-based. You also have peace of mind that this service is working for you and keeping your network safe and secure from those click-happy end users you might have.
To learn more about what our network engineers can do for your business, give us a call at 866-403-5305 or go to firewalls.com/services.
And thanks for joining us on this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get the latest episodes as soon as they are available. And please do rate and review us wherever you listen to the podcast. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We will be back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, we remind you to get secure, stay secure.